Hey everyone, ready to really get our brains working today?
I think so.
Okay, good. Because today we are diving deep
Deep,
into the fascinating world of how to actually think in English.
not just speak it.
Right. It's one thing to, memorize vocabulary and grammar rules,
Right.
but rewiring your brain to actually think in a whole new language,
Yeah,
that's next level.
it is.
So we're going to be looking at this super interesting article from English Harmony.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fantastic resource for English language learners.
It is, yeah.
And it really breaks down this whole process of thinking in English in a way that kind of blew my mind.
It's really interesting. Like
Yeah.
one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was, they talk about this tiny little delay
Uh-huh.
between when our brain forms a thought and when we actually say the words out loud.
Like a fraction of a second,
Yeah, it's like 600 milliseconds or something like that.
which is crazy. Like, why is that little blip so important when we're talking about language learning?
Well, it shows that there's something else going on.
Okay.
There's kind of a hidden step.
Interesting.
Before we even have the thought, I'm hungry,
Yeah,
there's this more abstract concept of hunger that our brain has to process.
I see.
And they give the example of waking up and feeling sick.
Hmm.
And even before you've thought the words, I need to call out sick,
Yeah.
you already have that concept in your mind.
Right, right. You just know you need to call out.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to get this. But how does that abstract concept idea actually tie into, like, speaking a different language?
Well, think about it. How many times do you find yourself translating in your head when you're trying to speak English?
Oh, gosh, all the time.
Right, so you're having a thought in your native language,
Mm-hmm.
then you're searching for the English equivalent,
Yeah.
and only then are you finally able to speak.
Right, it's like a whole extra step,
Yeah, it's like you're adding this extra layer of processing.
which really slows you down.
It does slow you down, and it prevents you from getting to that real fluency.
So am I, like, doing it wrong if I'm always translating in my head?
You're not necessarily doing it wrong,
Okay.
but it is definitely a less efficient way
But
to
yeah,
learn and speak the language.
I see.
Imagine if you could just completely bypass that translation step
Wow, yeah.
and just think directly in English.
Okay.
I think that's really what we're talking about in this deep dive.
So how do we get to that point? Like, do we just think really hard?
It's not so much about willpower.
Okay.
It's more about creating the right conditions for your brain to start thinking in English.
Okay.
And the author of this article really emphasizes the importance of speaking English as much as possible.
Like practice makes perfect kind of thing.
Exactly. It's like working out a muscle.
Right.
The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Okay, that makes sense.
And every time you speak English, you're strengthening those connections in your brain.
You're reinforcing those pathways.
Exactly.
But what about those times when you don't have anyone to practice with?
Like when you're alone? That's where this idea of self-talk comes in.
Talking to yourself.
Yeah, and I know it sounds a little bit silly.
It does sound kind of crazy.
But trust me, it makes a huge difference.
Okay.
So, like, imagine you're just walking down the street.
Yeah.
Instead of letting your thoughts wander, aimlessly, just try to describe what you're seeing around you in English.
Like the sky is blue. I see a bird.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like finding these tiny little moments throughout the day to just exercise that English muscle.
Precisely, and those little moments add up.
Now, remember in the comments section, someone named Rohit mentioned that they felt like their fluency actually went backwards at one point.
Oh, that's interesting.
Have you ever experienced that, like when you're learning something new and suddenly you feel like you're worse than when you started?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Really?
It's so common to hit these plateaus
Okay.
or even feel like you're regressing when you're learning something new.
Wow, so I'm not alone.
No, you're not alone at all. And actually, the author addressed this directly in the comments.
Oh, cool.
And he reassured people that these ups and downs are totally normal.
Okay, good.
It's important to remember that your brain is still processing all of this information behind the scenes.
So even if I don't feel like I'm making progress, something's happening in there.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about trusting the process and focusing on consistency rather than perfection.
Okay, so it's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Exactly.
That's a great analogy.
You wouldn't expect to run a marathon after one day of training.
Yeah,
And learning a language is very similar.
it's those small, consistent efforts over time.
Exactly.
Now, another commenter, Hansi, mentioned something really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
They said they don't have an inner voice.
Oh, wow.
You know, that constant narration that a lot of people have in their heads.
Right.
So they were wondering how you're supposed to think in English if you don't actually, hear the words in your mind.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Right.
Because it challenges our typical ideas of what it means to think.
Yeah.
And the author actually suggested that this kind of abstract thinking that Hansi described
Good.
might actually be an advantage when learning a new language.
How so?
Well, because abstract thinking is focused on concepts
Okay.
rather than specific words.
Right.
It might actually be easier to connect those concepts directly to English without having to go through that whole translation process.
So even if you don't have that little voice in your head
Mm,
constantly narrating your thoughts,
mm.
you can still train your brain to think in English.
Exactly.
Okay, that is fascinating.
It is.
So we've covered how speech works.
Yep.
We talked about the problem with constantly translating in our heads
Yeah.
and how to, create these little moments of English immersion throughout the day.
Absolutely.
Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
How do we take this thinking in English concept and make it, you know,
Practical.
practical? Yeah, like how do we actually do it?
Well, that's what we're going to get into in the next part of this deep dive.
Awesome.
We're going to explore some specific strategies that you can use
Okay.
to start shifting your mental framework and start thinking in English more naturally.
Sounds good.
So stay tuned for part 2.
We'll see you then.
See you then. Welcome back, everyone.
All right, so we talked about the theory behind thinking in English.
Right, like the foundation.
Now let's get practical.
Mm.
How do we actually start, building this mental house of English thinking?
Love that analogy, the mental house. So one of the first bricks I'd suggest is to start thinking in simple actions.
Like,
Don't go straight to trying to, translate complex thoughts or philosophical ideas.
right.
Keep it super simple, like,
Yeah.
I'm opening the fridge,
Yeah.
I'm pouring a glass of water, stuff like that.
As you're doing them,
Yeah, exactly. Like you're giving yourself a play-by-play of your day.
but in English.
Yeah. It might feel a little weird at first.
Like you're narrating your life.
Exactly. But the more you do it, the more natural it becomes.
Okay, I like that. And it doesn't have to be just, real life actions, right? Like what about using our imaginations?
Absolutely. Visualization is a really powerful tool.
Okay.
So you can close your eyes and imagine you're at a restaurant ordering food.
Okay.
Or describing your dream house or having a conversation with someone.
All in English, of course.
Of course.
I love that. It's like creating your own little English-speaking world in your mind.
Exactly.
But I think some people might struggle with that,
With what?
like feeling a bit silly.
Ah.
Especially if they're not fluent yet, it might feel like they're faking it.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually. The article talks about this, too.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, it really emphasizes the importance of embracing mistakes.
Making mistakes. But isn't that bad?
Well, not necessarily, because it's through those mistakes that we learn and grow.
I guess that's true.
Remember in Expor, one of the commenters who was really impressed with the clarity in the article? Well, there was another commenter, Harsh, who was asking about, trying to speak fast like a native speaker.
Ah, yeah, that's a common goal for language learners.
Right. They think that speed equals fluency.
Right.
And the author actually, he admitted that he used to think that way, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when he was first learning English, he was obsessed with trying to speak quickly.
Oh, interesting.
But he realized over time that it's not about speed.
So it's okay to have an accent and, pause and speak at a pace that's comfortable for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes focusing too much on trying to sound exactly like a native speaker can actually hinder your progress.
That's interesting.
It's like trying to fit into someone else's clothes.
Oh, yeah, instead of finding your own style.
Exactly.
Now, there was another commenter, Sasa Milosevic,
Okay.
who mentioned feeling blocked when they tried to speak quickly.
Oh.
They're the journalist, so I wonder if that fast-paced environment,
Makes it harder.
adds extra pressure.
The author suggested they try slowing down and focusing on clear and accurate communication.
So not rushing through things.
Yeah. Just take your time.
That's good advice, I think, for any learner.
It is.
It's so easy to get caught up in trying to sound perfect,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes it's more important to just slow down and really think about what you want to say.
I agree.
And speaking of thinking, there was this really insightful comment from another reader, Yuri Karabatov.
Yeah, I remember that one.
What did they say again?
So they made the point that when you start thinking in another language, it forces you to become more aware of your own thought processes.
Like thinking about thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because normally, we just think in concepts.
Right, not necessarily words.
Right. So adding language to the mix makes us really think about how those thoughts are formed.
I see.
He used the analogy of breathing.
Okay.
Like we don't have to consciously think about each inhale and exhale.
Right, it just happens.
And his point was that speaking in English should eventually feel as natural as breathing.
Wow, I love that analogy.
It's a good one.
But like we were saying before, it's a process, right?
Absolutely.
It doesn't happen overnight.
No, and I think another reader, Umer, was struggling with that.
Oh, in what way?
They were doing all the right things, like not translating and speaking as much as possible, but they still felt like this idea of thinking in English was a little bit fuzzy.
Like they couldn't quite grasp it.
Yeah, and the author's response was really interesting.
What did he say?
He said that thinking in English while you're speaking
Okay.
can actually help to solidify those thoughts.
So it's like the act of speaking makes the thoughts clearer?
Yeah, like they have more weight or substance when you're actually saying them out loud.
I see.
He also pointed out that we have more control over our speech than our thoughts.
That's true. My thoughts tend to wander all over the place.
Exactly.
Okay.
So even if you don't feel 100% confident in your thoughts, just start speaking.
Let's say something.
Yeah, and you might be surprised at how often the right words just come out.
Okay, I like that.
It's like your mouth knows what to say, even if your brain is still catching up.
Now, this reminds me of another comment from NPV.
Yeah, what did they say?
They were really trying to avoid using their native language at all, but they were struggling with complex thoughts.
Oh, I see. Yeah, when you're trying to express something really nuanced, it can be tricky.
Right. And they felt like they kept getting stuck.
Well, the author's advice was to try speaking in a more controlled and steady way.
So not necessarily fast.
Right. Just focus on being clear and deliberate.
I see.
It's like taking small steps instead of trying to leap forward.
Now, remember, Rohit, the commenter who was feeling like their fluency was going backwards.
Oh, yeah. How are they doing?
Well, they actually shared an update. They've been following the author's advice,
Oh, good.
and they said they saw some improvement.
Great.
But now they're feeling kind of stuck again.
Yeah, the dreaded plateau.
So are they back to square one?
Not at all. The author was really understanding about this.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and he reminded Rohit that these kinds of fluctuations are normal.
Okay, good.
Like, everything in nature goes through cycles.
Right, like the tide going in and out.
Exactly. So it's not a sign of failure if your progress isn't perfectly linear.
So it's okay to have those dips and plateaus.
Exactly. And he actually suggested that those dips might even be a sign
Of what?
that your brain is processing things on a deeper level.
Oh, wow.
So he encouraged Rohit to keep practicing, even if it feels boring, and to find new ways to challenge themselves.
So even when it feels like you're not making progress, just keep going.
Yeah, it's about trusting that something is happening, even if you can't see it right away.
That's such an important reminder. Sometimes the down periods are where the real growth is happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, he also said it's okay to take breaks.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, if you're feeling burnt out, step away for a bit
Right, recharge.
and come back refreshed. It's about finding a sustainable rhythm.
I think that's key with anything you're learning.
It
And no, all these comments and responses,
Yeah.
they highlight something really important about language learning.
What's that?
Community and support.
Right.
It can be such an isolating experience,
It can. Yeah.
especially if you feel like you're the only one struggling,
Right. And that's why it's so helpful to have people you can talk to.
to share your experiences with.
Exactly.
So find a language partner or join an online forum, or even just read the comments section like we're doing.
All of that helps.
Yeah, because celebrating each other's wins
Absolutely.
and knowing that other people are going through the same challenges as you.
It makes the journey so much more enjoyable and sustainable.
Speaking of different challenges and perspectives,
Yeah.
there was one reader, Michael,
Okay.
who had this whole list of allegations about language learning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like they were really adamant
About what?
that knowing all the little differences,
Between their native language and English.
yeah, was crucial,
Interesting.
like grammar rules and stuff.
Right. So they're coming from more of a grammar-focused approach.
Yeah, and that definitely works for some people.
For sure.
But, the author's method seems to emphasize immersion and practice
Right.
over explicit rule learning.
Yeah, it's like learning to swim by jumping in the pool.
Oh, versus studying the physics of buoyancy.
Exactly. Both methods have their place.
It's all about finding what works best for you.
Absolutely.
Now remember Hansi, the commenter, who doesn't think in words.
Yeah, they think in concepts.
Right, so they were asking how to apply this whole thinking in English idea to their situation.
It's a tough one.
Right.
Well, the author suggested trying to connect concepts with metaphorical feelings, like the smell of coffee or the feeling of sunshine on your skin.
Okay.
And he also encouraged Hansi to speak out loud, even without that inner voice.
So even if they're not hearing the words in their head?
Yeah, because the act of speaking can still help to build those neural pathways.
It's like sending signals to your brain.
Exactly.
Okay, wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this segment.
We have, haven't we?
Practical techniques, embracing mistakes, finding your own voice, dealing with plateaus, community support.
And different learning styles.
Right, because
Yeah.
everyone learns differently.
Absolutely.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
And I think that's the key takeaway here.
Yeah, there's no right way to do this.
Find what works for you.
Exactly what resonates with you, what feels natural and sustainable.
And don't be afraid to experiment.
Oh, yeah. Try different things.
See what sticks.
Now, before we move on to the final part of this deep dive,
Yes.
I want to touch on something the author said at the end of the article.
Okay.
He really emphasized the power of speaking out loud.
Ah, yes, because that's what really solidifies those neural connections.
Right. It's like putting all this theory into action.
Exactly. And he also reminded readers that their English will be unique.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's a reflection of their own personality and experiences.
So it's not about erasing who you are.
No.
It's about expressing yourself authentically.
But in a new language.
I love that.
Now, as we head into our final segment,
Okay.
I want to leave you with a question to ponder.
I love these thought-provoking questions.
What role does confidence play in this whole process of thinking in English?
Ooh, that's a good one.
How does that self-belief
Hmm.
impact our willingness to try new things,
To make mistakes.
to stumble, and ultimately to succeed?
That is a great question to think about.
And we'll explore that further in the final part of this deep dive.
So join us next time as we continue to unravel the mysteries of thinking in English.
We'll see you there.
Okay, so that question about confidence.
Yeah.
How much does it really matter
Yeah.
when you're trying to,
To think in English,
to think in English? Yeah.
I think it plays a huge role.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, think about it. When you feel confident, you're not so afraid to take risks.
Right, you're more likely to speak up.
Exactly. Even if you're not sure if you're going to say it perfectly.
You like that fear of making mistakes just kind of disappears.
Yeah, and melts away because when you're so worried about making a mistake, you're less likely to experiment,
Right.
to try new things, to really push yourself.
But when you feel confident, you're more open
Yeah, more open to learning
to making mistakes.
and growing from those mistakes.
So it's almost like confidence is this key
A key, yeah.
that unlocks the door to fluency.
I think it's more like the fuel that keeps you going on that journey.
Ooh, I like that.
The author of this article suggests focusing on those small victories.
Like what?
Like, remember those micro moments we were talking about?
Yeah, those little bits of immersion throughout the day.
Exactly. Each one of those is a win.
Even something as small as ordering a coffee in English.
Yeah. Or understanding a news headline.
Or having a short conversation.
With a neighbor or colleague.
Like each one of those is a little confidence boost.
Exactly. And they all add up.
So you're saying that recognizing those small successes can help build your confidence.
Absolutely. Each small win is like a stepping stone
To that bigger goal.
to fluency. Yeah. And it's not just about focusing on what you do well. Okay.
It's also about celebrating your unique strengths
Ooh, I like that.
as a language
Sure,
learner.
instead of comparing myself to other people
Right.
who might be more fluent,
Yeah,
I should focus on what makes me a good language learner.
exactly. Because everyone learns differently.
Right.
And your strengths are just as valuable as anyone else's.
And confidence isn't about being perfect.
No, definitely not.
It's about believing in your ability to learn.
to grow and to
Yeah.
keep going even when it's tough.
It's embracing that journey and trusting that you'll get there eventually.
Exactly.
Now, there was something in the article
Yeah.
that I found really interesting.
What's that?
The idea that thinking in a different language
Uh-huh.
can actually boost your creativity.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. Like you're tapping into a different part of your brain.
It's like you're opening up these new pathways and connections.
Them are dormant before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because each language has its own unique structure and rhythm and way of expressing ideas. So immersing yourself in a new language can really stretch your mind.
They force you to think outside your usual patterns.
I've even heard of writers
Oh, yeah.
who deliberately write in a second language
Wow.
just to access a different kind of creative voice.
It's like adding new colors to your creative palette.
Yeah. So whether you're a writer, a musician, an artist,
Anyone who enjoys creative problem solving.
learning to think in English could unlock this whole other level of creativity.
It's really exciting to think about all the possibilities.
It is. And it kind of brings us back to that question we asked earlier.
About how our thoughts can influence reality.
Exactly. If our thoughts can shape our reality,
Then what happens when we start thinking in a different language?
how might our relationships change?
Yeah.
Or our work?
Our sense of self, even.
It's like this invitation
To really embrace the power of language learning.
to transform yourself.
Absolutely.
Wow. So we've come to the end of our deep dive into thinking in English.
Hasn't it been interesting?
It has. I feel like I've learned so much.
I hope this has inspired you all to start thinking in English more.
Yeah, it's not about perfection.
No.
It's about progress
And perseverance.
and finding that joy in the journey of discovery.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking in English.
And who knows what amazing things you might create.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
We'll see you next time.